Do you really think appearance defines competence? That simple clothes or gray hair say anything about someone's character, knowledge, or strength? Then get ready, because this story is going to break you down. It's going to dismantle every prejudice disguised as opinion. It's going to disarm every judgment masked as common sense. It's going to expose just how much we still need to learn, especially in places that should be examples of fairness and equity. It all started on an ordinary morning at the Central Courthouse. The room was packed, as usual. Interns running back and forth, lawyers adjusting their folders, prosecutors reviewing files. Nothing suggested that day would be historic. Until they called the next name on the docket, Célia da Conceição Oliveira, charged with contempt during a public protest. In walked an older black woman. Calm face, slow but steady walk, her hair tied neatly. A simple but clean and pressed dress. She carried a small cloth purse. She walked silently to the center of the courtroom, while Judge Mariana didn't even bother to lift her eyes to look. With a pen in hand, the judge sighed, adjusted her glasses, and curtly said, "State your name for the record." Celia responded calmly, unshaken, but just the soft tone of her voice was enough for the judge to lose patience. She interrupted, criticized the tone, complained about the attitude. She said this was a courtroom, not a neighborhood meeting. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some scoffed, others just looked away. It seemed everyone already knew how this story would end. Another humble woman, accused, silenced, but no one there knew the truth. Celia wasn't just a protester, she was actually a renowned constitutional law professor with academic credentials from universities across Europe and Latin America. She was there as part of a research project, authorized by the National Council of Justice, to investigate how race, age, and appearance affect the treatment of defendants. She was the study, the mirror, the trap. And when she began to speak, she was no longer the underestimated woman. Her arguments flowed with surgical precision. Her legal references stunned even the most seasoned professionals. The judge, in shock, tried to interrupt, but each attempt was met with firm, indisputable legal grounding. Celia cited articles, doctrines, Supreme Court rulings. Every word was living proof that knowledge isn't worn, it's carried in the soul. The turning point came when one of the observers, present as an academic representative, stood up and revealed the truth. "Your Honor, may I inform the court that the defendant is Dr. Célia da Conceição Oliveira, postdoctoral scholar in human rights, author of 5 books, contributor to the European Council of Justice, and member of the International Commission on Racial Equality." Silence. Silence of shame. Silence of being caught in the act. Silence of realizing, too late, that this hearing was not just a trial. It was a lesson, a denunciation, a slap in the face of the system. The prosecutors lowered their eyes. The public defender, who had kept her distance, stepped closer with respect. The judge, she lost her footing. She tried to justify her actions, claimed it was a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. And like every powerful story that shakes the foundations, this one didn't stop there. The following week, the hearing footage was leaked. It went viral. It reached WhatsApp groups, social media, national news. Renowned legal scholars spoke out. Law students wrote articles. Thousands of people who had never considered what happens behind courtroom doors were now discussing institutional racism, implicit bias, and the dangers of superficial judgment. Celia became a symbol, but she refused to be a martyr. In interviews, she insisted, "This story is not about me. It's about how many Celias walk into these courts every day and are treated as if they're invisible. I had the privilege of education, opportunity, recognition. But what about those who don't, who stay silent, who have no voice or lawyer?" And the question echoed, loud and clear. Because this story challenged the logic of power. It showed that true respect doesn't come from robes, titles, or suits. It comes from listening, from empathy, from recognizing that justice only exists when applied with humanity. In the months that followed, the National Council of Justice launched a campaign about structural racism in the judiciary. Sensitivity training workshops were implemented. Mock trials began to include discrimination scenarios to train staff and judges. Judge Mariana received a formal reprimand and was required to attend mandatory training in racial equity and human rights. But the most important outcome wasn't punishment, it was awakening. This story lit a spark, a warning, a flame that, with luck, will become a wildfire against the walls of prejudice. And now, I ask you, how many times have you ignored a story because of how the person looked? How many times did you stay silent in the face of injustice because it wasn't your problem? How many times did you hold back when you could have said, "Hey, that's wrong"? Because in the end, what this story teaches is that true justice begins where hasty judgment ends. And if an elderly woman in a simple dress with a calm voice could shake the entire judicial system, what might you be capable of if you find the courage to act? Don't underestimate a story. It can be more powerful than a title, more strategic than a sentence, more transformative than any speech. And if this one moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Teach it. Because that's how we change not just the system, but the mindset behind it. The most powerful stories are those that force us to look in the mirror, and this one did that on a national scale. The entire country began to discuss what had always been there but many pretended not to see: structural prejudice within the most respected institutions. Influencers, teachers, journalists, everyone was talking about the case. Hashtags began trending, and it wasn't just about Celia. It was about every Black woman who had gone through something similar and had been silenced. The impact was so great that even legal authorities couldn't stay silent. The National Council of Justice issued a public statement in less than 24 hours, acknowledging the severity of the situation. Judge Mariana, who once presided over hearings with coldness, now found herself being judged by society. And this trial, unlike hers, had real merit. But no one expected the next chapter, because real justice doesn't stop at scandal. It demands reparation. When the foundations begin to shake, institutions can no longer pretend to be stable. As public pressure mounted, the National Council of Justice acted. A formal investigation was launched to examine Judge Mariana's conduct, with full review of the video footage, her words, and even her past rulings. In record time, she was placed on precautionary suspension. After all, how can you trust someone who judges with their eyes before listening with their ears? This kind of investigation is rare, but necessary. Because it's not just about punishing a judge, it's about protecting the very concept of justice. That hearing became a topic in universities, conferences, and international seminars. Professors revised their lectures. Students wrote theses. And in every one of those discussions, Celia's name was a turning point. That modest woman became a mandatory reference in debates on equity, judicial ethics, and institutional representation. The most powerful part of this story was the domino effect it triggered. Courts in other states began reviewing their protocols. Civil organizations proposed the creation of specific commissions on institutional racism. And suddenly, what started with a look of contempt became an entire movement of reflection. But the most surprising part was still to come. Because while many called for punishment, Dona Célia was preparing something far more transformative, something unwritten in law books, but capable of shaping the future. While many people waited for revenge, Célia delivered wisdom. She didn't lash out, mock, or turn her pain into a weapon. Instead, she spoke about education, empathy, and the chance to turn ignorance into learning. In an interview that went nationwide, she said, "Justice is not built on humiliation, but on awareness." And with that, she proposed something unprecedented, a mandatory course on racial equity for all members of the Brazilian judiciary. That gesture took everyone by surprise, and perhaps that's why it was so powerful. Because instead of revenge, she offered reconciliation with responsibility. She was invited to lead the project and, of course, accepted. The course wouldn't just cover laws, but lived experience. It would include real stories like hers and institutional practices that perpetuate inequality without realizing it. It was more than content. It was a mirror, and many people were about to see themselves in a way they never had before. Imagine the strength of that. A woman once dismissed by a judge would now teach hundreds of others how to see beyond prejudice. And it wouldn't be shallow or scripted. It would be direct, human, and disarming. Celia herself said, "We have to touch the sore spots." And it did start to hurt. But it was the good kind of pain, the kind that leads to growth. That's when Mariana, the suspended judge, returned to the scene. But this time, not to judge, to learn, and to face what she had once ignored. Some stories don't end in court. They become legacy, and that's exactly what happened with Celia's journey. The course she proposed became public policy. Universities began to include her case as a mandatory study in law, psychology, and sociology programs. A documentary was produced with real footage from the hearing and emotional testimonials. And more, her experience became a book, translated into 3 languages, even adopted by international institutions. But the impact didn't stop there. Courts across the country began revising their internal procedures. Programs were launched for active listening focused on minorities, new conduct codes for judges were implemented, and training simulations were created to combat bias. Even private companies took inspiration from the model, forming diversity committees that went beyond formality. The Célia case became more than a complaint. It became a beacon, a point of light where once there had only been silence and omission. And the most incredible part? All of this came from someone who had been discredited because of her appearance. It shows that great transformations are not born from shouting, but from the consistency between knowledge and purpose. All across Brazil, and even beyond, people began to rethink how they view authority, competence, and respect. And at one of those seminars, the presence of an unexpected figure drew attention: Mariana. Yes, the judge herself, ready to listen to what she had once refused to see. When life teaches, the wise learn. Mariana, once untouchable in her rigid and unquestionable posture, sat in the front row of the course led by Célia. For weeks, she listened to testimonies, watched videos, analyzed statistics, and, most importantly, looked within herself. It wasn't easy. Admitting that you acted with prejudice takes more courage than it seems, but Mariana did it. And at the end of the course, she wrote a public letter of apology, sincere, detailed, without excuses. She acknowledged her error with the same pen that once signed unjust rulings. That letter spread across the country. It was read in courtrooms, shared on social media, and cited as an example of institutional humility. Mariana went further. She proposed expanding Célia's course to other state courts, suggesting the content be added to ongoing judicial training. The gesture didn't erase the past, but it showed that even in the most resistant structures, change is possible. All it takes is for someone to take the first step and be willing to learn from the one they once ignored. That's when we understand the true power of stories. They don't just expose injustice, they also heal. Mariana, who began as a symbol of arrogance, had become a portrait of transformation. And Célia? She remained steadfast, as a mentor, teacher, and above all, a living example of how patience and knowledge can be more powerful than any sentence. But this story still carried a lesson that went far beyond the judiciary, a lesson that could touch anyone, anywhere. Some lessons don't need to be shouted, they echo on their own. Dona Célia's story became a national symbol, not because she fought the system with fury, but because she disarmed it with wisdom. Her humble demeanor, firm voice, and impeccable resume made more impact than any fiery speech. She proved that appearance doesn't define someone. What they carry inside does. And often, those who seem fragile are just choosing not to reveal their strength before the right moment. This story changes how we see the world. It reminds us that the next person we meet in line at the grocery store, at the bus stop, at the clinic, might be someone extraordinary behind a simple appearance. And that if we're willing to listen before we judge, we might learn more than in years of formal education. Célia didn't ask for recognition. She built it. And in doing so, she left a quiet legacy that can't be ignored. And maybe that's the most powerful part of all. The system was transformed from within. And if one humble woman, once dismissed, was able to shake such rigid foundations, imagine what you could do with the story you carry inside. Because we all have one. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to put yours in service of something greater. Now tell me, how many times have you jumped to conclusions based solely on what you saw? How many times have you left someone hanging, withholding your empathy, just because they didn't fit the mold you expected? Most of the time, we don't even realize it, but we keep repeating judgmental patterns, quick labels, impatient glances, silences that scream louder than words. And just like that, stories get lost every day. Stories that could teach, heal, inspire. Maybe you think this doesn't apply to you, but look around. Notice how society behaves. People are too rushed to listen, too proud to yield, and too distracted to realize the impact of their attitudes. The truth is, change begins in the smallest of places. In a conversation, a gesture, a simple, "Can you tell me your side of the story?" You don't have to be a hero to make a difference. You just need to be willing to listen to a story, all the way through, without interrupting, without judging. Now think with me. If even a judge, someone trained to analyze impartially, could fall into the trap of hidden bias and then publicly admit her mistake, why do so many still cling to absolute certainties about others? The judge in our video is not an isolated case. She reflects a system that values appearance over essence, titles over character, and speech over listening. But this story proved that when the truth comes out, no robe can hide a mistake. The woman who was dismissed in that courtroom didn't shout, didn't slam the table, didn't demand respect. She simply presented the facts. And those facts were stronger than any prejudice. Because when someone stands up with dignity, courage, and knowledge, even the arrogance of silence has to bow. That's what turned that trial into a milestone. And this story echoed beyond the courtroom walls. It reached social media, classrooms, study groups, bar conversations, because when a story is good, it spreads. And when it's true, it unsettles. It unsettles because it forces us to look in the mirror. And not just any mirror, the one that shows us the parts we usually avoid. Prejudice disguised as opinion, indifference masked as neutrality, arrogance cloaked as authority. But that's where the power of a good story lies. It doesn't come to soothe the ego. It comes to shake the foundations. And if this one made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first sign that something needs to change. But now what? What will you do with this reflection? Will you pretend you didn't see it? Will you keep scrolling until you forget? Or will you use it as a starting point to change the way you see the world? Because feeling indignation is easy. The hard part is turning it into action. And action is built in daily choices, in conversations, in your stance. It's when you choose not to laugh at a prejudiced joke, when you give someone space to speak even if you disagree, when you realize that hearing a story different from your own doesn't diminish you, it expands you. We live in a time when everyone wants to speak, but few are willing to listen. Everyone wants to teach, but few want to learn. And in this rush, we run over valuable stories. Stories from people who have so much to offer, but were never given the chance. And so every time you stop to truly listen, you're not just being kind, you're breaking a cycle of silence, exclusion, and dehumanization. And if this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, comment on it, discuss it, spark conversations that matter. Because while we stay silent, prejudice continues to act. It doesn't need an audience to grow, just complacency. And you have a choice. Be just another spectator, or be someone who changes the narrative. What will you do with this awareness? Let it die here or use it to transform the world around you. Don't underestimate the power of a story. It can change a life, a system, or even your mindset. That's what happened with the judge. That's what happened with the defendant. And it can happen with anyone. You know why? Because when we listen closely, we realize that everyone carries a truth worth hearing. And it's in that moment, when we stop judging and start listening, that real change begins. This isn't a scripted speech. It's not a rehearsed monologue. It's an invitation for you to see differently, act differently, and be different. Because it's not enough to watch a story that moves you if it doesn't change you. Feeling isn't enough. You have to act. And the first step is simple. Observe, listen, question, and choose not to be an accomplice to silence. If this made you think, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every video is an invitation to see the world with more awareness and be part of something bigger. While many people just get emotional, we aim to spark reflection. While others repeat old patterns, we choose to tell new stories. And you, will you be just another viewer, or will you help create the change? After all, the world doesn't change with ready-made speeches. It changes when ordinary people choose to make conscious choices. And every choice you make is like a new line in a vast collective story. A story that starts right here and can be written every day.